Well, I guess you can say with this film that third time's really not the charm. What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to my channel and another installment in my Spider-Man review series, where I review every single Spider-Man movie in the lead up to No Way Home. And today we're talking about the third film adaptation, 2007's Spider-Man 3. Before we begin, let me know in the comments what your thoughts on this movie were, if you already saw it or if you were planning on seeing it, and make sure to hit that thumbs up button if you like these reviews, as it helps me out immensely by getting my content out there. And if you're new here, I hope you consider hitting that subscribe button so you can stay up to date with reviews of new releases, older films, hidden gems, and so much more on a near daily basis. But let's jump right into it and let's talk about Spider-Man 3. This once again stars Tobey Maguire as Peter Parker. When a strange black entity from another world bonds with Peter, it causes inner turmoil as he contends with new villains, temptations, and revenge. So before we go any further, as I do with most of my reviews of older films, this is going to be filled with spoilers. So if you haven't seen Spider-Man 3 and you wish to know nothing, this is your spoiler warning. Go watch the movie, then come back to this. But anyway, here we go. So this one is going to be fun. The third film in Sam Raimi's trilogy is famously known for being a major step down from the first two films in terms of quality. Whereas both Spider-Man 1 and 2 were revolutionary for the superhero genre, this is considered a major misfire. It's not considered one of the worst superhero movies of all time, as the reviews were more mixed than flat out negative, but for many longtime Spider-Man fans, this is a movie that borderline doesn't exist to them. While normally the return of the entire cast and creative team of those first two movies should have made this another easy home run for the franchise, this wound up causing it to go out on a pretty low note. Because this is the first instance where Sony had their hands way too deep in the cookie jar. Sam Raimi and screenwriter Alvin Sargent had their own plans for this movie, with Raimi looking to go with characters that he felt would fit in a particular storyline and fit within the themes that these films have been touching upon. But Sony, in particular producer Avi Arad, who's still producing all the Spider-Man movies to this day by the way, had other plans in mind, with his biggest influence being the inclusion of Venom, a character Raimi initially did not want in the film, as he didn't care for his perceived lack of humanity. But he was obviously eventually convinced, as he was led to believe Venom was someone fans would want to see more than any of the villains Raimi included, in this case being the return of Harry Osborn, as well as the Sandman, here played by Thomas Hayden Church. And in addition, the producers insisted on the inclusion of Gwen Stacy, here played by Bryce Dallas Howard, who Raimi had initially not planned to include either, and it introduced a wide array of characters, conflicts, and subplots that caused the film to feel so complex that Sargent initially wanted to split the movie into two, though that idea was scrapped. And because of Sony's meddling with this film, and their continued meddling with the planned future installments, it caused Raimi to withdraw from continuing with this franchise, especially as he hated every draft of the planned fourth film's screenplay, and he felt he couldn't meet the deadlines Sony was setting, making this the final installment in this series, as it was then rebooted with Andrew Garfield. And it's unfortunate, considering how much of a dip in quality this takes after the second film, which has been hailed by so many people as literally one of the best superhero movies of all time, something that it's still recognized for to this day. We go from what people consider to be the best of the trilogy to the worst of the trilogy. Now, I will say, which I know will be a bit of an unpopular opinion, but I actually don't think this is quite that bad. I really don't mind this film and do think there are a number of really solid qualities about it, which we'll get into shortly. But seeing it, especially right after the excellent first two films, does feel a bit jarring, especially with the involvement of everyone from those first two films back for this. And I can see when watching it right after those first two films, how it can cause people to really not like it. But let's start with some positives. For one thing, I will commend this movie for continuing some of the storylines established in the first two movies, even if its themes aren't quite as strong this time around. The big one being the transformation of Harry Osborn into a villain, which was something that was teased ever since the end of the first movie. He didn't know the truth about his father at the end of that film, he said he'd make Spider-Man pay, his quest for revenge was explored in the second movie, where it ended with him being shocked by the reveal of Spider-Man's identity, and this now sees him accepting that in order to achieve the revenge he wants, he has to end his friendship friendship with Peter. Despite the fact that he didn't have such a great relationship with his father in the first film, he still had a great respect for him, even though they got into their share of horrible arguments. And that respect he has for him overtook the genuine friendship he had with Peter, who he was also jealous of anyway due to his relationship with MJ. I like that things were able to come full circle, and it was also not done in a way where Harry becomes a complete rehash of Norman. We don't see him putting on a different voice or have split personalities. We do see him use a lot of Norman's technology, and he is blinded by his own revenge against Peter, but as we see much later on in the film, he's not someone who completely loses his humanity. Similar to Doc Ock in the second film, there are still bits of the good person he once was underneath, allowing him to have this solid in-between of going a bit into Green Goblin territory, but not going full borderline irredeemable villain. So that was well done. And going back to MJ for a second, this sees Kirsten Dunst get arguably the most to do of all three storylines. I've said in my reviews of the other two films that even though she does fit into that damsel in distress trope, there's always been more to the character. And despite this film being the most overstuffed and a general step down in terms of quality, I think this is where she gets considerably the most to do. In fact, I'd argue she gives the best performance of anyone in this movie. She gets one of the better storylines where, now that Peter is a bit more comfortable balancing out his personal life with his life as Spider-Man, she's now the one who feels the most burdened by it. Even though she says at the end of the second film that it's her choice that she wants to be with Peter, knowing the repercussions, she's now seeing how that also means he can't be there for her at all times. While he's now fixed one issue where he wasn't even making it to her shows, now he's rushing off to go fight a criminal when she needs to talk to him, or when he does actually talk to her, he's inadvertently a bit dismissive of her as he doesn't understand how she feels. And this is as she's going through getting bad reviews in her play, being replaced and now unable to find work, and the person who's supposed to be there for her, her best friend, is either not there physically or not there emotionally. All while she sees him doing these publicity stunts like having Gwen kiss him as Spider-Man in a manner similar to how they first kissed in the first movie, and that reaches an emotional boiling point for her. And while thematically I'd say this film isn't as strong as the first two films, this is the one storyline where those themes are at its strongest. I thought this was easily the most nuanced of the subplots, one of the most emotional of the subplots, and it really got to highlight Kirsten Dunst's fantastic skills as an actor. And of course, it goes without saying, Tobey Maguire himself is once again very solid as Spider-Man here. Now, this time around, he doesn't get to have the most nuance of performances, but he's still likable and charming as ever here, and this also sees him at his funniest as the character, though some may argue it's all for the wrong reasons. Though while he doesn't get as much to do from an emotional standpoint, I'd still say he gets a little bit to do. The scenes of him and Mary Jane are still great, especially for the chemistry they have with one another, and the scene in which Harry forces her to break up with him is one of the more heartbreaking scenes of the film. Though where he really gets a lot more to do is in terms of the subplot with the Sandman, who's revealed to be Uncle Ben's true killer. And let's talk about him for a moment. While I don't think he's explored as in depth or his storyline was nearly as fleshed out as I would have liked, I still think that at the very least, he keeps in line with how the villains in this series have been. Because he's shown to not really be a bad guy, and he's just looking to raise money for his sick daughter. Now, that's something we've seen before with these tragic villains, but for the brief instances where we get to explore the more nuanced side of the character, I thought Thomas Hayden Church did a fine job, working well with what he was given. Now, the one key difference between Flint Marko and both Norman Osborn and Doc Ock is that he isn't some arrogant man who basically caused his own downfall. Here, he's just someone who accidentally gets caught up in a science experiment gone wrong, this time completely against his will, as this was while he was on the run. And he's the complete opposite of the quippier villains that we're used to, instead keeping his dialogue very brief each time we see him, with the film relying more on visual storytelling to convey how he may be feeling, with his take on the character being compared to silent movie star Lon Chaney and his portrayal of misunderstood characters portrayed as monsters, like the Phantom of the Opera and the Hunchback of Notre Dame. And we see that especially in the birth of the Sandman, where he emerges after the experiment in what's easily one of the more visually stunning sequences in the film. We see him trying to comprehend what just happened to him, and we see, even through all the CGI, the pain he's experiencing as he attempts to do something simple as grab his daughter's locket, and for a moment, he's unable to. It's in this sequence where the film's at its finest, along with the sequence towards the end where he reveals what truly happened with Uncle Ben, which by the way includes a cameo by Cliff Robertson in what turned out to be his final film role before his death. And we see the guilt he still feels over the whole thing as, similar to Doc Ock when he comes to his senses, he doesn't want to be remembered as a killer. And with this, Thomas Hayden Church gave one of the better performances, bringing out out as much of the complexity of the character as he can. And similar to the first two movies, another area where this does well is the action scenes, especially with digital effects continuing to get better and better. This marks another improvement in terms of just how polished the film looks in terms of its visuals. Now, there are some instances where the green screen looks a bit more obvious and it does feel a bit dated there, but all of the action scenes are once again very exciting and choreographed well, from the Sandman fight scenes to the final showdown, and it does mark a nice uphill trajectory in terms of how far effects have come. Plus, lastly, we can't forget the return of J.K. Simmons as J. Jonah Jameson, providing a nice chunk of the comedic relief. I'd say this brings his screen time back down a bit from the second film to somewhere on par with the amount he was in the first movie, but once again, he's another bright spot in this film, with nearly each and every scene providing a good laugh. From the first time we see him, where Betty Brant keeps buzzing him about his medications, to his last scene where he's watching the final fight and attempting to get a camera from a little kid. So there are a number of really commendable things about this movie that do make it legitimately entertaining, and I do think this movie isn't necessarily one that's deserving of all the hatred. But that being said, when you do watch it right after seeing the other two movies, it's understandable why it's as frustrating as it is. And with that, let's talk about the major problem this film has. And that's, it bites off way more than it can chew, which again is really the fault of Sony's interference rather than anything done by Raimi or Alvin Sargent themselves. The inclusion of Venom is this movie's biggest downfall, because now, unlike the first or second movie where Spider-Man only had to deal with one villain, he now has to deal with three: Harry, Sandman, and now Venom. And there are multiple reasons for why this storyline does not work. For one thing, I don't have anything against Topher Grace in general, and I do think his scenes as Eddie Brock himself are fine, as he's good at playing an arrogant jerk. But as far as actually playing this menacing villain, he completely misses the mark. He simply just doesn't do a very good job at selling himself as this physically imposing being. We see sequences of Brock talking while completely covered in the symbiote, just with his face uncovered, and it comes off as a bit too silly. And I know I've said previously that this series is one where it fully embraces the silliness that goes with superheroes and supervillains, and normally that is a good thing. But this just doesn't sell what it's trying to convey here. Like, in the first film, Willem Dafoe's Goblin costume isn't the best, but you still buy him as a legitimate threat because of how strong his screen presence is. The cackling and taunting does lead to some darkly humorous moments, but he's also able to use it as a way to convey to us how sinister of a villain he really is. The confidence in his voice, his incredibly strong delivery, and the damage he does each time we see him makes up for the fact that his costume looks like something out of the Power Rangers. Or you take Doc Ock. Yes, he has 4 giant limbs attached to his back, but again, he's a man who means business, and he conveys that every time we see him. When he becomes this mad scientist, he cuts right to the chase anytime he shows up to attack, and goes immediately for what he needs with literally no hesitation. And what helps too is that Alfred Molina is a big guy, so it gives him this larger-than-life presence to help convey the sort of threat that Doc Ock is. But here, the few times we see Venom in full costume, most of the time, he makes a few threatening remarks, but other than the final fight, he doesn't do much else to truly convey how much of a force to be reckoned with that he is. And Topher Grace's delivery just doesn't fit with what they're looking to go for. He has this softer tone of voice that doesn't really make for someone aggressive or threatening, so it makes his scenes feel awkward. Now, maybe if we spent more time with him, it would be a different story, which leads to this film's other big issue, which is that it can feel all over the place. If you ever need an example of an overstuffed movie, look no further. This is a 2-hour or so movie that's tasked with not only continuing with certain storylines set up in the first 2 movies, but then give us 2 brand new major villains who we've never seen before, and give us enough reasons as to why we should care about anything they do. And it's simply too much to handle in a 2-hour movie. The Venom storyline is one that feels very obviously shoehorned in. It literally feels like it interrupts the rest of the movie. Like we were meant to just get these other 2 much more compelling storylines, and this just interrupts things. We don't get much of an explanation regarding the symbiote other than that it comes from this random meteorite that crashes at the beginning of the film. And from there on, every single dramatic beat, wherever it's involved, feels noticeably rushed. Like when it first latches onto Peter, he winds up just accepting it right away, saying it's cool, and when it eventually latches itself onto Eddie, we see him with it for like a scene before the final fight. There aren't as many moments where we get to actually see how it affects these characters emotionally or explore as many of the nuances as we normally do. And because of the sheer amount of screen time dedicated to this subplot, it takes away from everyone else and causes even legitimately good parts of the movie to feel rushed. Like with Sandman, he's a solid part of the film's first act and one of the more intriguing aspects to explore. But after his initial first couple of fights with Spider-Man, he disappears for like half the movie until the very end. Or even some of the stuff with Harry, like where his change of heart after this whole big rivalry with Peter comes in this very tacked on, contrived sequence where his butler, who was never a major character in any way in this franchise, walks in for literally one scene in the final act, tells Harry he tended his father's wounds and saw he died by his own blade, and that causes Harry to reconsider his vendetta against Spider-Man. It's this very tacked on, out of nowhere moment that causes a huge pivotal sequence for an important character, and it just feels hokey. It's just not a moment that feels earned, especially after all the build-up from the first two movies. Though one other subplot that didn't really work either is this bizarre storyline where Harry gets amnesia early on, and he doesn't recall any of the events of the first two movies, leading him to briefly be on good terms with Peter again, and it allowed the film to sideline him for like half the movie so we can focus on these sequences involving the symbiote and Venom that felt like they were out of a completely different movie. So here we have this major storyline that was teased through two movies that could have provided for a great emotionally charged third movie, and that storyline gets put on pause for at least 30 minutes. It's actually a shame considering what we could have got, as when Harry does get his memories back, it does lead to some great character drama, and it does lead to that continuation of the series' themes and storylines. Though there's also one moment when he very first gets his memories back that feels way too silly. The only good thing that came out of this Venom subplot is what's basically the film's most infamous sequence of events, where Peter becomes quote-unquote emo Peter, where the symbiote brings out the worst parts of his personality, and he goes out on the town, dancing everywhere he goes, strutting around and flirting with every girl he meets. And while some people hate these scenes, I find them to be absolutely hilarious, as do a lot of people apparently, as it's become one of the biggest memes to emerge from this entire trilogy. And it's the one major plot point of the film where it truly ventures in that campy territory that we especially saw during the first film. By this point, especially with Batman Begins having already been released and it saw a shift in the tone that went into superhero movies, campiness was something that was no longer quite as welcome as it was just 5 years ago, especially since this is the series at its most ridiculous at a time when people wanted more serious superhero movies. But I still found it to be fun for what it was, and it did give us a few of the film's more memorable moments.
Oh, look at little Goblin Jr. Gonna cry?
For a lot of people, especially longtime Spider-Man fans, I know they're a bit insulted by these scenes, but these are all a nice bit of goofy fun that at least got to see Raimi, Maguire, and everyone else have one final blast with the series, even if it wasn't what we should have got. And while I do enjoy the movie overall, I do wish that Sony didn't get as involved as they did. While it did lead to one of the most memed sequences in all three films, I would have much rather preferred something that didn't have the Venom storyline, and we got the proper conclusion to 2 movies worth of build-up with the Harry storyline. Plus, we could have gotten considerably more screen time with Sandman, and we could have explored more of his psyche the way we did with the Green Goblin and Doc Ock, rather than him just feeling like an afterthought after the halfway point. And then maybe we could have gotten more installments with Raimi behind the helm, as he had ideas at least through Spider-Man 5. And I know the further along we get with film franchises, the riskier it is to keep them going while still maintaining that creativity. It was still clear there was a vision behind these movies, from arguably one of the best genre filmmakers out there. And while we do have these 2 classic superhero movies as a result of that vision, it's a shame we were ultimately deprived of how many more potential classics we could have possibly got. I get why a lot of people hate Spider-Man 3, and it is without a doubt a bit of a mess. But I don't think it's that bad. While the Venom storyline feels clearly shoehorned in and it diverts a lot of attention from two much better storylines, there's still plenty about it that's either emotional or entertaining. The action scenes are once again solid, the cast does a fantastic job all around, with some standouts being Kirsten Dunst and Thomas Hayden Church, and it still does a solid enough job at continuing some of the same themes and storylines that carried over from the first two films. I get how jarring it is, especially coming off the excellent second movie, and its flaws are very prevalent, but overall, I maintain it's not a bad time. Spider-Man 3 gets a 7 out of 10. Is it necessarily a very good movie? Not at all, and I think my opinion of it has actually gone down slightly since I first saw it, as I used to defend it even more, but I maintain it's an entertaining movie. In some cases, maybe not for the right reasons, and there are some legitimately good qualities about it. I just do wish Sam Raimi got to make the movie he wanted to make, as I'm sure this would have been on the same level as the first two movies if he did, or at least close to it. And like I said, then we could have possibly gotten more entries with these characters on his own terms, which I'm kind of sad we probably won't get again. But what can you do? Stay tuned though, as up next, we'll be discussing the first reboot of this franchise, The Amazing Spider-Man. And in the meantime, let me know, did you see Spider-Man 3, or are you planning to see it, and what were your thoughts? Do you actually not mind this one, or do you think it's as bad as everyone says it is? Let me know in the comments below so we can discuss. Also, if you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it, and for more movie reviews and film discussion, please make sure to hit that subscribe button to stay updated. Thanks for watching everyone, and keep having fun with film.